The Theater History Podcast is supported by HowlRound, a Knowledge Commons by and for the theater community. It's available on iTunes and howlround.com. Hi, and welcome to the Theater History Podcast. Our guest today is Dr. Charlotte Canning. She's the Frank C. Irwin Jr. Centennial Professor in Drama in the Department of Theater and Dance at the University of Texas, Austin. And most recently, she's the author of On the Performance Front, U.S. Theatre and Internationalism. Dr. Canning, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me, Michael. I'm really excited to be here.
Okay, so the title of your book talks about U.S. theater and internationalism. What is that latter term? I mean, what does that mean?
It's a good question. And let me just like any good scholar, let me back it up and say there's a history to that term. And it started from a very interesting place. I'm a member of the feminist research group of the International Federation for Theater Research. And about 10, maybe even 15 years now, we started a focus on globalization. And as one of the few historians in the room, I started puzzling about what is globalization. And I thought, does it have a history? So as I began reading and thinking about that, I stumbled across internationalism that in some ways is a precursor to globalization, but in some ways is its very own individual movement. And it's something that really, in some ways, is contained within the 20th century. It was a sort of a theory and a practice, many of times which didn't line up with each other, about how nations and people should cooperate. And that perhaps the cooperation that happens across national boundaries might produce better results than treating problems as bounded by geopolitics, by national boundaries. And it was a very exciting moment for me because a lot of the theater history I was looking at seemed to me to be very defined by nation states, which is not something that globalization pushes back on, right? That it's not about the nation state as definitive. Whereas it seemed to me a lot of what was happening in theater in the 20th century was very much shaped by, influenced by, coming out of the ways in which nation states were relating to one another. And so once I had that, I was sort of off and running.
And you identify kind of two coexisting, but also kind of two things that are in conflict. This idea, on the one hand, as you write, these internationalist U.S. theater artists who, in this I'm quoting you directly, quote, saw theater as a productive way to make the world a better place for all. On the other hand, this same impulse often got, I think it's fair to say, co-opted by organizations like the U.S. State Department. You say at another place, in some ways, every arm of the U.S. government would be called upon to operate as a cultural ministry, as if the arts were too important to be left to a single agency.
Yes, and that was what was also interesting to me about internationalism, is that the ways in which it meant different things to different theater communities in different nations. So what happened was, before the Cold War, as the U.S. theater community was gradually participating in international efforts, they were doing so, I don't want to be too utopian and say on an equal footing to other countries, but it certainly was largely without the knowledge or even interest of the federal government or even state governments, government of any kind in the U.S. They were pretty much independent actors. Whereas once you get into the Cold War, what happens is, as nations begin to realize that cultural diplomacy, that is what's often called soft power or soft diplomacy, is a very effective tool, then the state in the U.S. became incredibly interested in how artists were going abroad, for what reasons, what work they were taking abroad, and who the audiences were that they were meeting when they got there. So it very much changed the calculus for U.S. artists, and then had an impact on the world theater scene because, of course, what the U.S. thought people should see, the U.S. government, thought people should see, and what maybe other theater artists wanted to see were not always the same kinds of work.
And one of the really cool things that you do, starting off in this intro, is talk about not just like theater itself, but the sort of famous political events, certainly of the Cold War, in theatrical terms. I mean, one thing that I never knew was that Churchill's famous use of the phrase Iron Curtain was actually a theater metaphor.
Yeah, it was so funny. I had encountered Iron Curtain in my theater research, but it's one of those moments where you have an epiphany, but the minute you try to tell someone else the epiphany, it sounds like the most obvious thing in the entire world, right? So I was rereading something and I suddenly went, oh, Iron Curtain, right? Like fire curtain, and I was almost speechless in sort of my in the discovery, because it was both so, it was one of those incredibly lovely moments where things are going to come together in a beautiful way for a theater scholar, and we know as theater scholars that's not always the case. But it was also a moment where you're sort of embarrassed, like, oh yeah, maybe I should have made this link years ago. But anyway, it became a very exciting moment for me because I realized it was a way to push back on how Churchill had so endeavored to take charge of the sort of metaphoric or what would you call it? Like the metaphor, the sort of the spectacle of the Cold War, and define it in his terms, and that is in the West's terms. So I started thinking, obviously, he was not very interested in the theatrical implications, right? For him, there was a whole nother set of things that he was trying to call into action with that metaphor. But I thought, wow, who is the audience then? And who is performing? And is the audience controlling the performance? And are the performers performing at the pleasure of the audience? Or are the performers the one in charge and telling the audience what they will see? Because it seemed to me, from the way Churchill's words work, is his implication was that the West was in fact the audience. So I thought, oh, is he saying then the audience is the ones in power and the people on stage are our puppets? Yet, of course, if you talk to anyone on the supposed other side of the curtain, I don't think they saw themselves as puppets of the West or performing at the command of the West. So I thought it was a really potent metaphor because it also helped us think about the ways in which we struggle as theater scholars and practitioners about that relationship between performers and audience and how power circulates between them.
You just mentioned, this sort of famous speech of the Cold War, but that's not the only historical period that you cover here. Your book spans pretty much the end of World War I all the way into the mid-'60s, and we'll talk about why you end in the 60s later on in the interview here. But you start out with this publication called Theater Arts, a big, big deal in sort of 20th century U.S. theater. What was this publication? Why is it so important to your research?
Theater Arts was such an amazing discovery for me because I think for my generation of scholars, it was really for my generation of scholars, it would have been our most senior teachers who would have known this as a living publication. And it really was the first serious publication about theater in the United States. So it wasn't concerned with gossip. It wasn't a backstage or a sort of trade publication the way, say, Variety might have been or the paper Backstage was. You didn't look in it for auditions or who was hiring or any of those things. It was a really the first time that theater was going to be looked at as a serious intellectual endeavor in the sense of the arts having a thoughtful component. It was largely it was sort of birthed by the progressive reform movement, the idea that the arts should be controlled by the people. So it was very interested in little theaters, which now we might say are more akin to community theaters or community-based work. It was very interested in theater being used in education. It published articles not just about university theaters and by university professors, but also theaters in high schools. So it really was interested in theater as a broad-based activity that happened all over the country, not just in New York, not just or New York in sort of major urban centers. They were very careful. There's one article on the theaters of North Dakota. I challenge you in any current publication on theater to find a long, thoughtful article on the theaters of North Dakota. It was also, and this is where I started to learn more about how internationalism was always part and parcel of the U.S. theater. It was also committed to bringing the U.S. theater into conversation with theater of the world. So there is not a single continent, well, okay, not Antarctica, which as far as we know doesn't have a lively theater scene, but it had articles on multiple and different kinds of theaters from Asian countries. It treated South America not as just this big mass, but as very different individual countries with their very specific theater histories. It had theater from Africa, theater from Eastern Europe, theater from Russia. I mean, it was very capacious in its view, which is not to say it didn't have the biases of the profession in that it tended to favor Western European theater. It tended to favor the sort of growing movement of a very hierarchical theater. That is, they were the big champions of the emergence of the director as a sort of the right way to do theater. But it really was extraordinary to find it, not only because of the contents of it, but as I read more of what a lifesaver it was to so many theater people across the country, and how many of them wrote about how that publication transformed their lives. That as they were isolated in their small communities or growing up with no examples of theater other than maybe a local community production, it gave them this, as one of the editors would later say about internationalism in general, it gave them a window onto the world. And that was very moving to me. I thought that was so beautiful. And I also had this very funny, very lovely, complete coincidence, which was that in the 1940s, the regional theater kind of pioneer and director, Margot Jones, who also directed many of Tennessee Williams' first work and was really an amazing theater artist who died young, and so some of her work is now forgotten. But she taught at UT during World War II. Or that is the University of Texas during World War II, when, of course, so many male faculty were in the military. And she, I don't know how it happened, but all the theater arts, all her copies of theater arts ended up staying here. So when I was first starting the research and I saw on the shelves of one of our sort of storerooms this huge run of almost the whole run of theater arts, I was sort of baffled. I asked the department if I could borrow them so I could bring them home to work on them. They were happy to have the shelf space. And as I went through them, I suddenly found many of them she had signed them and said, this is my copy, Margot Jones. So I also felt this enormous, profound, affective connection to the journal, because I was reading the very ones that Margot Jones had read, which is a bit sentimental, but I also always felt like I was sort of, by including her in my book, she was also providing me with the research to make the book possible.
So one of the other really interesting figures who publishes in theater arts is someone named Hallie Flanagan. That name might be familiar to some listeners, but could you just remind us who she was?
Yeah, I mean, Hallie Flanagan is such a key figure, although she's not often remembered. The thing that, of course, people know her best for is that she headed the Federal Theater Project, which was the project to bring theater artists back to work during the Works Progress administration of the Depression. So one of Franklin Roosevelt's many New Deal projects. For example, if you want to see a luminous portrayal of her, I highly recommend the movie The Cradle Will Rock, which Tim Robbins made several years ago. And the most amazing Cherry Jones plays Hallie Flanagan. Cherry Jones, I think, is one of our best living performers, and I have forever fixed her in my mind as Hallie Flanagan, although they didn't exactly look the same. But she does an amazing job bringing Flanagan to life. So that's what Flanagan is best known for. However, one could argue that some of her biggest contributions were as a professional director who committed her career to higher education. She first taught at Grinnell, which is in the Midwest. From there, she moved to Vassar, in large part because she was very ambitious and wanted a professional career and knew that her career would be enhanced by being close to New York City, because Vassar is by train, about 90 minutes from New York City. Later in her career, she moved to Smith College, where she became a dean. But she was also one of the first people to make the argument that academic artists could work out their theory and understandings of performance both through writing, that is books and articles, as well as through practice. So she had a lab. She worked extensively with undergraduates. They created productions based on work she had seen. She was very influenced by the work that was happening in Russia in the teens and 20s. So she's looking at artists like Meyerhold and Mayakovsky and groups like the Blue Blouses and so on. And she's bringing that work back to the U.S. She's one of the first U.S. directors to do so, which is not really how she's remembered. But I wanted to work on her in that identity. So I don't talk very much about her work in the Federal Theater Project in the book, not because it's not important, it very much is, but because I wanted to trace her impact on U.S. theater in those different routes, as an academic, as a theorist of theater practice, and as an activist, which I felt were identities that had kind of fallen away over time, and that we remembered her only as the person who fought valiantly to keep the Federal Theater Project when the U.S. Congress was determined, and then successfully defunded it.
Well, and that connection to the Soviet Union, which you mentioned briefly, that's kind of a running thing. We were talking earlier about the Cold War context of the later part of the book, but this relationship with the Soviet Union and how American theater, United States theater, I should say, related to the Soviets, borrowing on the one hand, but also then sometimes touring productions as a kind of soft cultural power.
The relationship between the U.S. and the Soviets in terms of the arts across the 20th century is a really profound one, not easily reduced to the platitudes of the Cold War. When I started the book, I had the opportunity to have lunch with a very eminent British scholar, a historian also of the Cold War. And I said to him, I wasn't seeing any work that treated sort of the period from the end of World War I up through maybe the 50s or 60s, treating that as a period. I said, it seems to me everybody talks about interwar years and Cold War. And he kind of looked at me, he said, yeah, that's right, I don't think there is anything. So I largely followed that model in terms of time frames, but I really do look, in my mind, the book makes, if perhaps not an overt argument, at least suggests an argument that one could look at an arc of that relationship between the end of World War I and into the 60s, when the Cold War sort of shifts and that's more complicated. But I was really interested in the ways in which the Soviet Union was in conversation with, the artists of the Soviet Union, particularly theater practitioners, were in conversation with U.S. theater practitioners as much in the 20s and 30s as in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And I thought that was something that we didn't often talk about, that there were people who worked on the sort of teens, 20s, 30s, and then there were people who worked on the Cold War, but there didn't seem to be as much about how that was an arc in its own right. And that those artists were learning from one another. I mean, my book takes up a fraction of that story. For example, I don't deal much with the importance of the lineage of Stanislavski and his theories of acting and the way in which they develop in the U.S. and the way people like Stella Adler, who was one of the best acting teachers of the 20th century, studied with him, brought that work back to the U.S. and so on. So there's still a million histories to be written on that. But I took this particular thing of thinking about, I guess you could say, theater infrastructures in the U.S. and how they came to be and how artists and theater leadership were developing it through their contact with theater in other parts of the world.
your mention of infrastructure brings up an organization called the American National Theatre and Academy. Could you talk a little bit about them? And also specifically, they had a role, very interesting thing that you bring up, in bringing a tour of Porgy and Bess to Moscow, among other places.
ANTA's a really interesting, long, complicated story. It's actually not quite over. It actually still exists, at least on paper and at least in the IRS office. And paperwork is filed on it every year to keep it as a living organization. But of course, it hasn't been an active organization for decades. It was founded in the early part of the 20th century by a bunch of philanthropists in Philadelphia who, very much in the U.S. tradition of the arts being often funded and supported by private wealthy individuals, thought that the U.S. should have a national theater just as European nations did. So it was very much a kind of noblesse oblige, our gift to the nation kind of thing, which of course meant because no theater professionals were involved, it didn't really go anywhere because these wealthy people knew nothing essentially about the theater other than they liked to go and thought it was a good thing, which is not nothing. We're happy they thought that, and it would have a huge impact on U.S. theater. But the work that they themselves did kind of ground to a halt after they were chartered by Congress. So essentially this group existed on paper. It had a congressional charter. It had the equivalent of what we would call, say, 501c3 status, that is not for profit, didn't have to pay taxes and so on. But it had no theater people attached. It wasn't doing anything. Unfortunately, the timing was very poor as well. It was founded in the late 1930s with the start of World War II, both abroad and then again later in the U.S. There was no energy or, there was no energy behind it. And there was nobody to do it because everybody was doing other things. So it languished, but theater people knew about it and they knew it existed. And there was a whole new generation of young theater people who essentially were coming out of the military. They had been, in the world, they'd been doing things. They were filled with energy. There was very much a sense at the end of World War II that we were kind of in a new world and there was so much that was possible. The same kind of energy that founded organizations like the United Nations or UNESCO was very much located in individual countries. And so a couple of relatively young, they had theater experience. They had both been very active in the 1930s, were seasoned professionals. Robert Breen and Robert Porterfield decided to take this organization and make something of it. And for several years they did. It became a very vibrant part of the U.S. theater scene, more as maybe a clearinghouse and a producing arm, a research bureau that people could contact across the nation. It also collaborated with some other existing national theater organizations. And they really managed to knit people together and create a lot of ideas that would come to fruition under other people. And probably the most important one, and this is what both Breen and Porterfield really wanted to do with ANTA, which was create what they called a foundation, which was the idea was that it would be a national funding foundation, that it would be a place where theater people could come with ideas and get funding. So they thought in order to achieve that, what they had to do was make an argument to the U.S. that theater was in the national interest, that theater was well worth funding. This was not an argument that existed. There had been attempts across history, across the 20th century really, to create national theaters. All of them had failed. So what they decided is we have to get out there. We have to, what we would say now maybe is something like we have to create a brand that everyone recognizes. The way they ended up doing this, it was partly by design and partly just by circumstance, was to partner with the U.S. State Department, create, supply them with artists for national tours. ANTA invented the peer panel. So now this is an old idea to us. The national endowments use it, right? You bring together a bunch of peer artists, they look at the applications for grants, and they make the choices about who should get them. They make the recommendations to the heads of the agencies, and then the agencies make the final call. But the idea is that artists identify artists' work as being worthy and valuable. Peer review, of course, is a part of many, many professions, not just the arts. So what happened was ANTA then became the organization that the State Department used to identify musicians, dancers, and theater artists who would go abroad. So these programs, theater was a very small part, jazz and music were the biggest part, dance was also part. So groups like the Alvin Ailey Company for years was largely supported by its State Department tours. Musicians like Louis Armstrong became indelibly identified with cultural diplomacy. But theater played a role too, and probably the best known production was a production of Porgy and Bess that toured the world for 4 years, between 1952 and 1956. It was directed and produced or co-produced by Robert Breen. So the same person who had thought we need to make ANTA be something was also key in terms of making theater be present. He was able to get a huge chunk of money out of the U.S. government to pay for it. For example, they had a tour throughout South America, up into Central America, ending in Mexico, that was entirely paid for by the U.S. government. Also, they had a couple of stops. One was more a concert version in Northern Africa that was also paid for by the U.S. government. The rest was your standard kind of commercial tour with impresarios and depending on box office and so on. But it became the way the U.S. was known. And while it's largely forgotten now, it was one of the best known theater events during that time. The President Eisenhower mentioned it often. It was written up almost every day. There would be something in newspapers, the major national newspapers, that would then get picked up by local stringers. It was a huge presence. And of course, one of the reasons was that it was the first production from the U.S. to tour the Soviet Union. Individual U.S. theater artists had been going to the Soviet Union. Sometimes their plays, for example, Lillian Hellman, one of her plays was done in the 1930s in the Soviet Union, and she was able to go over and be part of the production. But no actual production that had originated in the United States had ever toured the Soviet Union. So it was an extraordinary moment for a triumph for the theater leadership of the U.S., but it was also an extraordinary moment in terms of diplomacy and the U.S.'s reputation as having what we used to call culture and being a cultured nation, as opposed to a nation of, as one person put it, chewing gum and bridges, sort of that we were good at pop culture and technology and nothing else. So by saying we can do opera too, it was a major coup for the U.S. government.
Now, in talking about ANTA, this brings up, you mentioned foundations, endowments, all these organizations that support the arts. You effectively end the period of history that you look at in your book with the establishment of the National Endowment for the Arts. Why did you choose that as kind of your main endpoint?
That's such a good question, because I struggled for a long, long, long time about that, because it was one of those moments, and I know my artist friends have similar moments in their work where it feels right, but you can't articulate to anyone else why. And then until you can articulate it, you can't really justify it as a choice. So it took me a long time, but what I finally realized was there were two important things that happened in that kind of moment of the endowment comes in 65, so it's sort of 63 to 65, also sort of coincides with Kennedy's presidency, is that there were two important things. One was the Cold War really shifted. Once the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, it was very, very clear that neither the Soviet Union nor the United States was going to blow the other side off the planet. We weren't going to nuke each other. The Cold War shifted radically at that point. It was no longer the Cold War of Stalin and freezes and et cetera, et cetera. It was much more than a Cold War of political diplomacy rather than a real fear that the other side was going to nuke. The one side was going to nuke the other. That was largely over. So that's a huge shift in terms of an explosion of culture, the fears around containment, the kind of Red Scare. A lot of that stuff fades very quickly at that point, and had been fading for a while. I don't mean to sound like it was an on and off switch, but that was a really key shift. The other, though, was what I realized, the reason that this really felt like the endpoint in the narrative I had constructed was when the NEA comes on board, when there is now an actual national foundation funding the arts, it radically changed the art scene in the U.S. So the art scene that I had been writing about, that had largely come out of the end of World War II and progressive reformism and the influences of the art theater movements of the late 19th into the 20th century in Western Europe, as well as in Eastern Europe and Russia, were no longer... that story had changed, was changing. The National Endowment comes online in 1965 by something like, and I don't have quite the dates and the numbers, but by 1970 or the early 1970s, the number of what we might now call regional theaters in the United States had grown 10 times. So it was a huge transformation of the theater landscape. Part of it also was still due to foundations like the Ford Foundation giving a ton of money in different places to different theater companies. But a lot of the theater companies that we think of, maybe we could call them, I don't know, this is a little dicey, but a kind of second wave. So not say the Goodman or the Guthrie, which are pre-1960s, but a lot of those theater companies that come after are possible because of the NEA. There's also now a kind of national imprimatur, right? For an artist to get an NEA grant, it was also not so much about the amount of the grant, but the fact that you had one meant you could easily get other grants because you had kind of been certified as an official important artist. So it was a really important pathway to funding that changed artist strategies around how they made their careers and where they made them and what kind of work they thought would get them where they wanted to go. This was not the way you could work in the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s. There was not that kind of funding infrastructure that would allow you to work that way. I mean, just as I think now, if you want to write such a history, the shift in the early 21st century, where something like the NEA no longer has that cachet or sway or even funding, means artists now think in other ways about how they construct their careers. So that was very important to me, that the geopolitical story I was telling really changed in the early 1960s, and then the arts, practice, and infrastructure story I was trying to tell really shifted in the early 1960s.
So throughout this historical period that you're talking about, at least from the artist's perspective, you talk about how they had this, what was basically a utopian vision. Go back to that quote about how they saw theater as a productive way to make the world a better place for all. I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit about what relevance, what lessons that might have for us today in the 21st century. As you just said, the way that we think about theater, how it's funded, what it's supposed to do, is shifting. And even as we talk, the political, cultural, social landscape is shifting in some really surprising, shocking ways. What do we get from that sort of utopian vision and experience that these international theater artists at least tried to create?
That question really sustained me while I was writing the book. I think in part because when I'm teaching and a student says, they want to write on X or Y, I always ask them the same question. And I know it's a version of the question that my practitioner colleagues ask their students, which is why this, why now? So I felt that I had to have a reason, a contemporary reason in my own time for writing this particular history. And it really came to me about being why theater is important. Why do I continue to commit my work to that art form? And I really believe that one of the things I learned was how and why theater is important and what it can do. And I felt that perhaps it could be useful to contemporary, in our time, theater artists who are trying to make arguments about why the arts and theater are in the national interest by looking at what their predecessors had done. So I learned a lot about how to make arguments to the general public, to the government. I learned a lot about the kinds of often very Faustian bargains we have to make to do the work that we want to do. I was incredibly moved by these very sort of, what would you call them? Not cynical, perhaps, but sort of maybe crusty and somewhat jaded theater professionals who had been doing leadership and bureaucracy stuff in the theater world forever, being excited and willing to just stuff envelopes in order to get ANTA off the ground, or in order to help UNESCO found the International Theater Institute, which is the NGO that was founded basically alongside UNESCO, that would look particularly at theater and still exists today, and does some really important work around linking theater artists around the world. And to see that continual recommitment to the idea that theater could make things better really reminded me that that is one of the things that sustains us as artists, practitioners, as scholars, as activists, as teachers, right? Is the idea that theater can be an incredibly rich and vibrant way to make an argument for positive change. It's not that, theater will get that bill passed, but that theater in its way helps us remember how we are a community to another. It helps us remember how we construct ideas and how we talk to one another. I write about specific plays and productions in the book, some of which I think would have been amazing and well worth seeing, some of which I think would have been horrible, and we're very lucky to be born long after they closed, but all of which those artists, from the directors and producers down to the person who is maybe an understudy and never gets to go on stage, were fully committed to the ideas that by doing the work, they were doing something good for the world, that they were making an argument they wanted to make as artists. And I was fortunate enough that I got to write about some of our best artists. I got to write about people like Maya Angelou and Hallie Flanagan and Leontine Price and William Warfield. And I even have a little part with Harry Belafonte. I got to write about people like Hallie Flanagan and Margot Jones, Tennessee Williams and Arthur Miller. And there's a huge number of artists that appear in the book. And one of the things they all shared was the idea that what they were doing was important, and that it was doing something good in the world, and that maybe the energy that comes out of theater is an energy that can help us, sustain us, inspire us to do things elsewhere in other moments. Going back to a little bit of where we started, right, with thinking through internationalism and the connections among people, they very much believed that if people could talk to one another, if they could see each other's work and ideas, if we could see how other people understand the world, maybe we could make different choices. Maybe we would not want to bomb other people. And we don't know. Maybe. Okay, so this is an extraordinary statement that I cannot back up with any kind of research whatsoever. But maybe in part, the Cuban Missile Crisis worked out the way we did because those Russians had seen Porgy and Bess. We don't know. I think we should just believe it's true, and we'll prove it later. But I do think that the fact that there was this contact. Tom Stoppard writes a play where he's arguing that rock and roll brought down the wall, right? So arts played a huge role in the direction of the Cold War, and I believe as we're looking at the challenges ahead of us, we are going to be turning to the arts just as much, and that we are going to be thinking about how we can make work about the current situation that might help other people understand where they are and why they're doing what they're doing, and how they might do something else.
Dr. Charlotte Canning's new book is On the Performance Front, U.S. Theatre and Internationalism. We'll include a link to more information about it in the show notes. Charlotte, thank you so much for being a guest.
Thank you for inviting me. I had a wonderful time.
If you'd like to continue today's conversation, please visit howlround.com and follow HowlRound and @TheaterHistory on Twitter. A big thank you to the staff at HowlRound who make this show possible. Our theme music is The Black Crook Gallop, which comes to us courtesy of the New York Public Library Libretto Project and Adam Roberts. Thanks as well to Tip Kress, who designed our logo. And finally, thank you for listening.